You're here because you want to get what's really driving global politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And today we're diving into a pretty provocative idea
Yeah.
that recent American foreign policy moves are, well, actually fueling a whole new era of great power competition.
Exactly. We're digging into an opinion piece, this one's from Al Jazeera Net, that makes precisely that argument.
Okay.
So our goal really is to just cut through the noise a bit and understand the author's core claims, and what evidence they're putting forward.
Gotcha. Okay. So the author seems to kick things off by looking at Donald Trump's time in office.
Yeah.
And some pretty wild ideas mentioned, like wanting to annex Canada, Greenland, even the Panama Canal. It sounds almost unbelievable.
It does sound pretty extreme, doesn't it? But the author uses those statements, I think, to highlight a certain mindset.
Right.
More tangibly, though, the piece points to actions like, pulling out of the WHO, the UN Human Rights Council, the Paris Climate Agreement, plus dialing back support for NATO and foreign aid.
Okay, so a pattern of withdrawal.
Yeah, definitely signals a move away from, let's say, traditional international cooperation.
And then there's the whole trade war thing, particularly with China.
Right, the author brings that up, too. Sees the economic disruption, even with some tariffs easing later.
Sees it as what?
As another example of this maybe go-it-alone approach, something that potentially shakes up the established order.
Okay, makes sense.
Precisely. So the author's take is that these actions really prioritize unilateral power. Then the piece shifts to the Gaza conflict. It notes that kind of whiplash from initial ceasefire talk to then discussing Palestinian displacement and this vision of American control, this Rivera of the Middle East idea.
Wow. And that alongside support for Israeli actions.
Yes, exactly. That contrast.
It's a really stark contrast, isn't it? The author argues this inconsistency, this focus on, I guess, perceived national interest above all else.
Weakens things.
Yeah, weakens international law, ethical standards, the institutions meant to uphold them, like the UN, international courts.
And what's really interesting is where the author goes next.
Where's that?
They make this leap. The idea that if raw power just takes over, the whole concept of the nation state as we know it could start to erode.
How so?
Well, the thinking is that larger states, hungry for resources, minerals, water, farmland, might just start absorbing weaker neighbors.
And that ties right back to those annexation comments you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The author even points to Gaza's potential economic value.
Oh.
Things like gas reserves and that potential Ben Gurion Canal project linking the Red Sea and Mediterranean.
Which would be a massive shift in global trade routes.
Huge. So the piece suggests these could be underlying motives for territorial ambitions.
Okay, I see the connection.
And the author's clear. This obviously clashes with Palestinian rights, international law, and that recent ICJ advisory opinion.
Right. So this brings us to the ripple effects then. How are other powers reacting?
That's the next step in the argument. The piece suggests America's actions could perhaps embolden Russia.
In what way?
To pursue its own goals. Points to Crimea, eastern Ukraine, and the worry that creates in Europe about Kyiv's future.
Understandable anxiety.
And similarly, the author raises the possibility, just the possibility, mind you, that China might feel more inclined to act on Taiwan.
Okay, and closer to the Gaza situation.
Within the Middle East, yeah. The idea is the Israeli right wing might see a window, an opportunity to push harder for its objectives in Palestine.
Like annexing parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
Potentially. That and maybe further asserting control over Jerusalem. The piece also mentions potential friction from Israeli actions in Syria.
Clashing with Turkey?
Clashing with Turkey's strategic interests, yeah. And interestingly, it notes this shifting regional dynamic, maybe Iran's influence lessening, Arab states playing perhaps a more limited role.
So, wrapping this author's view up, what's the big picture takeaway here?
They believe this great power competition, which they see as partly fueled by U.S. policy, is fundamentally destabilizing the whole international system, undermining the rule of law.
And the consequence? More instability.
Potentially. More instability, more conflict, maybe even a redrawing of the map as new power balances emerge.
Like who?
Well, the piece hints at a possible confrontation between, say, China, Russia, and the U.S., with the EU sort of trying to find its own path.
Yeah.
And the author really concludes by stressing that these shifts, particularly under Trump, mark a really significant turning point.
A turning point requiring Arab states, in particular, to urgently rethink their strategies.
That's the author's final emphasis, yes.
Okay, so let's boil it down. This Al Jazeera piece argues that recent American foreign policy is viewed by the author as a key catalyst for a new era.
An era of great power competition.
Driven by what the author sees as almost imperial ambitions and a disregard for the established international rule.
Right. And for you, the listener, the crucial takeaway is probably just seeing how interconnected everything is. Actions by one major power.
They really can send ripples everywhere, have profound consequences.
Awesome.
Which leaves us with this final thought to chew on. If we accept this analysis, even just for argument's sake, what are the most critical factors that will actually determine the future balance of global power?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something to ponder.